In 2014, freelance artist Ansel Hsiao opened a copy of Star Wars Imperial Handbook, a commander's guide, and found his own work staring back at him. His Lambda shuttle renders, his Imperial Star Destroyer imagery, his Executor-class visualizations, all appearing in an official Disney publication. He hadn't been paid, he hadn't been credited, and the billion-dollar corporation that owned Star Wars was profiting from work he'd spent years creating. 2 minutes of work in Photoshop. That's what Hsiao estimated it took for someone to steal years of meticulous modeling, technical calculation, and artistic refinement. Someone grabbed his renders, dropped them into a layout, collected a check from Disney, and moved on with their day. Meanwhile, the actual creator, the person who had done the real work, got nothing. But here's the part that makes this story more than just another tale of corporate exploitation. Hsiao's work wasn't just good enough to steal. It was so good that Lucasfilm had already officially adopted other pieces of it into canon 2 years earlier. The same corporation that commissioned his designs for the Essential Guide to Warfare in 2012, properly credited, properly compensated, was now selling a book containing his uncredited work in 2014. They knew who he was. They knew what his work was worth. They took it anyway. The Star Wars universe you know, the vast Imperial fleet, the intricate doctrines, the technical specifications that make the whole thing feel real, wasn't built in some gleaming Lucasfilm design lab. It was built in apartments and home offices by obsessive fans who loved this universe more than the people who owned it. Fans who did the work. Fans who calculated hull plating thickness and hangar bay capacity because they cared about whether the Empire's military actually made sense. Fans who gave more to Star Wars than Star Wars ever gave back. Ansel Hsiao, known online as Fractal Sponge, is the most prominent example of this phenomenon. But he's not alone, and the pattern of corporate appropriation extends far beyond a single incident with a single book. To understand how we got here, you need to understand the chaos that Hsiao walked into. February 1992. Dark Horse Comics released the second installment of Dark Empire, a groundbreaking comic series set after Return of the Jedi. Artist Cam Kennedy filled those pages with exactly what fans craved. Massive Imperial warships looming in orbit over Biss, the Emperor's hidden throne world. The grim industrial aesthetic. The overwhelming sense of imperial might. But Kennedy was illustrating a comic, not designing a fleet. When he drew those ships in the background, they were impressionistic shapes, silhouettes, suggestions of oppression, without commitment to the kind of technical precision that Star Wars had trained its fans to expect. These weren't fully realized vessels. They were anonymous Star Destroyer number 2 and anonymous Star Cruiser number 5. Background dressing for the real action happening in the foreground. Kennedy gave them a vibe, the feel of imperial dominance. He didn't give them names, dimensions, reactor specifications, hull configurations. That work, the work of transforming artistic suggestion into technical reality, would fall to someone else entirely. The fans of 1992 didn't know they were looking at incomplete sketches. They saw these vessels and immediately began cataloging them, debating them, trying to make sense of how they fit into the Imperial Navy's order of battle. The Star Wars expanded universe was exploding during this period. Novels were establishing continuity that the films had never bothered to develop. And the fans were consuming everything, trying to build a coherent picture of this galaxy from 1,000 contradictory sources. The problem was that those sources couldn't agree on anything. Official sources provided maddeningly little guidance. Lucasfilm, the company that owned this universe, that licensed these publications, that supposedly maintained continuity, couldn't be bothered to establish consistent answers. The fans noticed. Of course they noticed. These are people who track every background detail, who freeze-frame space battles to count turbolaser emplacements, who debate whether the ventral hangar bay of a Star Destroyer could physically accommodate the number of TIE fighters various sources claimed. 3 years after Dark Empire, in 1995, a fan named Curtis Saxton launched the Star Wars Technical Commentaries. The The project would become legendary within the community, representing one of the most ambitious attempts to impose logical consistency on a franchise that had never particularly cared about logical consistency. Saxton's project was simple in concept, staggering in execution. Take every ship that had ever appeared in Star Wars media, films, comics, novels, video games, and figure out how they actually worked. What were their dimensions, their crew complements, their weapon loadouts? How did they compare to each other? The Star Wars technical commentaries became the definitive resource for fans who wanted to understand how this universe actually functioned. Not the broad strokes of galactic conflict, but the granular details, the engineering, the logistics, the stuff that made suspension of disbelief possible for people who thought about these things. And a lot of people thought about these things. One commenter described Imperial lore as my drug. That's not metaphor, that's addiction. These are people who can spend hours debating whether the Victory-class Star Destroyer's reactor output is consistent with its observed combat performance. People who notice when a ship's hangar bay doors are positioned in a location that would require starfighters to navigate impossible trajectories during launch operations. People who care about logistics. Saxton's technical commentaries established the precedent. The fans would build coherent world building because the corporation wouldn't. They would do the work that Lucasfilm should have done, but hadn't. And their work would become so authoritative that the corporation itself would eventually be forced to acknowledge it, or steal from it. Into this ecosystem emerged Ansel Hsiao. Hsiao wasn't some weekend hobbyist dabbling in Star Wars art between other pursuits. He was a professional freelance 3D artist specializing in hard surface modeling and spaceship concept art. His portfolio would eventually include work on the UNSC Infinity cinematic for Halo 4, serious professional credentials in an industry where those credentials matter. His commission rate reflected his expertise, $80 per hour, with full ship designs typically requiring 30 to 100 hours of work. As he would later note, this was cheap for the quality of output. A single vessel might represent $4,000 to $8,000 worth of skilled professional labor. Hsiao was pouring that expertise into Star Wars for free. When he looked at those shadowy background ships in Dark Empire, he didn't see mysteries to speculate about. He saw unfinished work, design challenges, problems to solve. And so he began the painstaking process of engineering them into existence, modeling them in 3ds Max, calculating their proportions, determining where the hangar bays would logically be located, how the reactor systems would feed the weapon emplacements, what thickness of hull plating would be necessary to withstand the abuse an Imperial warship would endure in combat. The methodology Hsiao brought distinguished him from typical fan artists. Official Star Wars sources operated under what might generously be called rule of cool. If something looked impressive, it got included, regardless of whether it made engineering sense. The dimensions were inconsistent. The weapon counts varied between sources. The internal layouts were never specified because no one at Lucasfilm had thought about where the crew actually lived or how supplies moved through the ship. Hsiao inverted this priority structure entirely. He began with function, then derived form. When designing the Executor-class as a dedicated carrier, he didn't just decide it should have hangar bays. He calculated how many starfighter squadrons it would need to support. A dedicated carrier should support multiple wings, meaning hundreds of starfighters, plus support craft, plus maintenance facilities, plus crew quarters for all those pilots and technicians. That's not just hangar space. That's fuel storage, ordnance magazines, repair bays, flight control centers, medical facilities for combat casualties, training simulators, briefing rooms. Where do you put all of that on a 2.2-kilometer hull? Hsiao worked it out. He worked out where the carrier bays would be located to allow efficient launch and recovery of starfighter squadrons. Then came the defensive calculations. A carrier is a high-value target. Enemy commanders will prioritize destroying it to eliminate your starfighter support. The Executor needed point defense coverage sufficient to survive concentrated attack while its fighters were deployed. He calculated what kind of point defense weaponry would be necessary to protect against enemy strike craft. He determined hull plating thicknesses and reactor configurations, working out what structural requirements different areas of the ship would have. The result was a ship that made sense, not just aesthetically, functionally. His Executor could be tested against hypothetical attack scenarios. You could simulate an enemy fighter strike and determine whether the point defense coverage was adequate. You could calculate how long it would take to deploy the full starfighter complement. You could work out crew rotation schedules based on the size of the habitation sections. Official Star Wars designs couldn't survive that scrutiny because official Star Wars designs were aesthetic objects, not engineering solutions. The Executor had originated as that unnamed 2.2-kilometer vessel orbiting Biss in the 1992 Dark Empire 2 comic. Cam Kennedy drew it as a triangular shape, suggesting Imperial power. Hsiao engineered it into a functional warship, and in doing so, created something that exceeded the quality of what Lucasfilm's official contractors typically produced. The gap Hsiao filled wasn't merely aesthetic, it was epistemic. Lucasfilm owned the Star Wars intellectual property, but Lucasfilm had never actually done the work of figuring out how the Empire's fleet was structured. They had George Lucas's original trilogy designs, the iconic Star Destroyer, the TIE Fighter, the Death Star, and they had subsequent additions made by various artists across novels and comics. But they had no unified technical framework. The fans built their own databases. Saxton's technical commentaries. And these fan resources did what official sources wouldn't. They synthesized. They analyzed. They picked the most logical interpretation and built consistent frameworks around it. Hsiao's designs existed within this ecosystem. When he created the Executor, he wasn't just modeling a cool-looking ship. He was filling a doctrinal gap that official sources had left empty. The Imperial Navy needed dedicated carriers, vessels optimized for starfighter operations, rather than general-purpose Star Destroyers that happened to carry some fighters. That role existed in real-world naval doctrine, and it should exist in Imperial doctrine. Lucasfilm had never bothered to design such a vessel. So Hsiao did. Through the early 2000s, he posted his designs to his personal website, fractalsponge.net, and to art platforms where the Star Wars fan community congregated. Each new design demonstrated the same obsessive attention to detail. The Executor-class Star Destroyer originated as another anonymous background ship in Dark Empire, what fans had cataloged as Anonymous Star Destroyer No. 2. Hsiao christened it with a Latin name meaning skirmisher or forward runner, and conceptualized it as exactly that, a forward-deployed screening vessel for the main fleet. Smaller and more agile than the Imperial class, capable of operating independently on patrol and reconnaissance missions, or massing with the main fleet for major engagements. He calculated its performance envelope. A vessel operating independently needs different capabilities than one fighting as part of a larger formation. It needs longer range, better sensors for reconnaissance, enough firepower to handle most threats, but not so much that it becomes a resource drain. The Executor's design reflected these requirements, a hull optimized for speed and endurance rather than raw combat power. The Bellator-class dreadnought emerged from Anonymous Star Cruiser No. 5 in the same comic. Hsiao engineered it as a fast battleship/battlecruiser, measuring 800 meters shorter than the Mandator class. It could chase down fleeing enemy formations. It could respond rapidly to emerging threats. It had a specific role in Imperial doctrine. The distinction matters. Real-world naval history offers plenty of examples of fast battleships versus standard battleships, battle cruisers versus heavy cruisers. Different missions require different capabilities, and an effective fleet needs vessels optimized for different roles, rather than a single hull type trying to do everything. Lucasfilm's approach to the Imperial Navy ignored this reality. They designed ships that looked cool, and figured the fans would fill in the rest. They were right. The fans did fill it in. But Lucasfilm wasn't supposed to then take that work without paying for it. Each vessel Hsiao designed came embedded in doctrine. The Executor as a dedicated carrier, hanging back from the main line of battle, launching and recovering fighter squadrons, providing the sustained starfighter support that Imperial doctrine required. Its 2.2-kilometer hull carried enough fighters to achieve local space superiority, while its point defense armament protected against enemy counterstrikes. The Precursor as a skirmisher, forward deployed, operating ahead of the main fleet, screening against enemy scouts and harassing enemy supply lines. The Bellator as a fast battleship, speed and firepower combined, capable of independent operations or massing with the main fleet, combining the hitting power of a dreadnought with acceleration that traditional dreadnoughts couldn't match. Each had a role. Each role implied operational contexts. Each operational context implied relationships with other vessels. The result was a fleet that made sense as a military organization, not just a collection of cool-looking triangles floating through space. The Star Wars fan community, hungry for this level of detail, treated Hsiao's work as canonical. Not officially canon, that designation remained Lucasfilm's to bestow, but spiritually canonical. If you wanted to know what the Executor-class looked like, you didn't consult those vague comic panels. You went to Fractal Sponge. If you wanted to understand how Imperial carriers operated, his work was the definitive source. The community consensus was clear. This guy had done the work that Lucasfilm should have done, but hadn't. His designs weren't just popular, they were authoritative. Then came the Executor-class Star Dreadnought, and the stakes changed entirely. Unlike the Executor or Precursor or Bellator, which had been extrapolated from existing comic imagery, the Executor was entirely original. Hsiao designed it from scratch in 3ds Max 2011. A 15-kilometer star dreadnought featuring a distinctive T-shaped bridge tower that immediately became iconic within the fan community. 15 kilometers. To put that in Imperial context, the standard Imperial-class Star Destroyer was far smaller. The Executor fell into a category of massive vessels, larger than any conventional Star Destroyer. Hsiao didn't just decide on that length arbitrarily. He calculated what role a vessel of that size would fill in Imperial doctrine. The Executor filled a gap. At 15 kilometers, it was designed as a command dreadnought. Hsiao worked out the proportions. The T-shaped bridge tower provided elevated sensor arrays and command positions while maintaining the family resemblance to other Imperial designs. He considered how the bridge would function, where the crew pits would be located, how information would flow from sensor stations to the command walkway. The Executor wasn't interpretation or elaboration of existing material. It was pure creation. Hsiao had invented a warship that didn't exist in any Star Wars media, and made it so convincing, so perfectly aligned with Imperial design philosophy, that fans accepted it immediately as something that should have been official all along. The Executor represented proof of concept. Fan creators weren't just filling gaps in official content. They were producing superior work on their own initiative, creating vessels that fit more coherently into the Star Wars universe than what the actual owners of that universe were producing. The Vigil-class corvette followed the same pattern. It originated entirely as a Fanon vessel designed by Hsiao, conceived as a heavy corvette for escort, reconnaissance, and utility duties. It provided the Empire with a vessel capable of handling tasks too small for a Star Destroyer, but too important for standard patrol craft. Like the Executor, it was pure invention. And like the Executor, it possessed such convincing adherence to Imperial design philosophy that fans accepted it as canonical, regardless of its official status. When your unofficial work is indistinguishable from, or superior to, official output, what does official even mean? Lucasfilm noticed. In 2012, Lucas Licensing, the division responsible for managing the Star Wars expanded universe, officially approached Hsiao to provide artwork for The Essential Guide to Warfare, a comprehensive guide to military conflict in the Star Wars galaxy. Author Jason Fry confirmed this collaboration. The Essential Guide to Warfare was ambitious. It attempted to synthesize decades of fragmented military lore into a coherent history of galactic conflict. It needed visuals, images of the ships and battles that the text described, and the publisher recognized that Hsiao's work was superior to what their internal artists typically produced. Hsiao submitted his designs. His designs and names were officially recorded into the Holocron Continuity Database. The Executor-class, the vessel he had painstakingly engineered from a vague, comic background ship, now appeared in official essential guide literature. His nomenclature, Secutor, Procursator, Bellator, became the official names for ships that had been anonymous for 2 decades. 2 years later, the Executor-class appeared again in James Luceno's novel Tarkin, published in 2014, cementing its status as established canon. This should have been the triumphant conclusion. The passionate amateur, vindicated. The fan whose meticulous work proved superior to corporate output, officially recognized. Hsiao's designs in the holocron, his name in the credits, his contribution to Star Wars history secured. The 2012 collaboration represented the proper way for a corporation to engage with fan talent, approach them, commission their work, credit them appropriately, compensate them fairly. Whatever one thinks of Lucasfilm's broader handling of the Star Wars franchise, that collaboration demonstrated that legitimate engagement was possible. Hsiao's designs entered canon through the front door, with proper acknowledgement. And then came 2014. The same year that Tarkin canonized the Executor-class, official Star Wars illustrator Joe Caroni produced artwork for Star Wars, Imperial Handbook, a commander's guide. The Imperial Handbook was formatted as an in-universe Imperial military manual. It featured tactical information, organizational charts, equipment specifications. It was positioned as an official Star Wars publication, bearing the imprimatur of Disney and Lucasfilm's licensing authority. And within its pages, readers familiar with Hsiao's work encountered something troubling. His Lambda shuttle renders, his Imperial Star Destroyer imagery, his Executor-class visualizations, all appearing without his consent, without credit, without payment. These weren't interpretations or homages. These weren't cases where 2 artists independently arrived at similar designs. These were his actual renders, the same files, repurposed for a commercial product from which other people would profit while he received nothing. Hsiao's response came in the form of a blog post titled, "Hey Disney and Joe Caroni. Someone put so little work into using my stuff without attribution," he wrote, and likely got paid a decent amount for 2 minutes of work in Photoshop. The frustration was palpable. The injustice wasn't just financial, though the financial dimension was real. At $80 per hour, a single complex render could represent dozens of hours of skilled labor. His commission structure meant a fully rendered ship scene might be worth $4,000, $6,000, $8,000 of professional work. Someone had taken that labor and converted it into their own paycheck. More galling was the sheer laziness of the appropriation. Someone had looked at Hsiao's publicly posted renders, work he'd shared with the fan community because he loved Star Wars and wanted to contribute to the collective world-building effort, and decided to pass them off as their own work. Copy, paste, invoice Disney, move on. Meanwhile, the actual creator got nothing. The contrast was damning. On one side, years of obsessive craftsmanship from a professional 3D artist who loved this universe enough to engineer its fleet properly. On the other, a quick copy-paste job by someone cashing a Disney check. The billion-dollar corporation wasn't just failing to match fan quality. It was parasitizing fan labor while paying other people to do the parasitizing. The community response was complicated. Some commenters on Hsiao's ArtStation presence noted that it's not Lucasfilm who are at fault here. It is the artist trying to palm off Ansel's work as his own. That is the direction the lawyer should be. This framing, blaming the individual contractor rather than the corporation, deserves careful examination. On one level, it's technically accurate. Caroni made the decision to reuse Hsiao's work. He's the one who took someone else's renders and submitted them as part of his own commissioned work. If there was theft, Caroni committed it. But this lets Lucasfilm off the hook for creating a system where such appropriation was structurally incentivized. Consider the production environment. You're a contractor working for Disney. You've got tight deadlines. You need to produce Star Wars content that looks authentic, content that matches the visual language fans expect. And you know, Everyone in the industry knows that there's a vast ecosystem of fan art available online, much of it higher quality than what Lucasfilm's internal teams produce, all of it freely accessible. The temptation to appropriate isn't just predictable, it's built into the business model. Lucasfilm hired contractors without robust verification processes, or at least without processes robust enough to catch Caroni's appropriation before publication. Lucasfilm benefited from the resulting work. Lucasfilm sold the book and collected the revenue. And when appropriation was discovered, the corporation itself faced no consequences. Hsiao wrote his blog post. Some fans got angry on his behalf. The Star Wars merchandising machine rolled on, profiting from work it hadn't paid for. Lucasfilm may not have directed Caroni to steal from Fractal Sponge, but Lucasfilm created the conditions under which such theft was predictable, profitable, and, as far as the evidence shows, consequence-free. This incident didn't occur in isolation. The relationship between corporate intellectual property and fan creation has been contested territory for decades, and Lucasfilm specifically has a complicated history with the creators who love their franchise. What the broader pattern of fan-corporate conflicts reveals is an asymmetry built into franchise ownership. Corporations claim absolute control over their intellectual property when fans create content. You can't make a Star Wars film without permission, can't sell Star Wars merchandise without a license. But when those same corporations want to use fan-created content, the rules seem to soften. The boundaries blur. Somehow, the rigid IP protections don't apply in reverse. Hsiao's Star Wars ships are undeniably derivatives. They exist within and depend upon a universe that Lucasfilm created. The Imperial aesthetic, the triangular Star Destroyer profile, the TIE fighter design language, the overall visual vocabulary of Imperial military hardware belongs to Lucasfilm. Hsiao's vessels are extensions of that aesthetic, contributions to a universe he doesn't own. Can you claim ownership of a design that's fundamentally built on someone else's foundation? The short answer, it's complicated. Copyright law protects original creative expression. A fully realized 3D model represents significant original creative expression. The specific geometry, the detailed texturing, the particular solutions to design problems. But that expression exists within the framework of copyrighted intellectual property. The characters and settings and visual language belong to the IP holder. Lucasfilm's lawyers could potentially argue that any derivative work automatically belongs to them, that fans who create Star Wars content do so at Lucasfilm's sufferance, and that the corporation can do whatever it wants with fan creations. This argument has legal merit in some jurisdictions. It has no moral merit whatsoever. Because even if Hsiao can't claim full ownership of his Star Wars designs, even if Disney's lawyers could construct an argument that derivative works are corporate property, that doesn't make what happened right. It doesn't make the appropriation ethical. It doesn't excuse the laziness of taking someone's carefully crafted renders and passing them off as original work. Legal right and moral right aren't the same thing. Lucasfilm has the legal right to do many things with fan work. That doesn't mean they should. And it certainly doesn't mean the community should accept it when they do. Hsiao wasn't alone in the high-fidelity fan design space. Other artists operating in this space include E.C. Henry, Krzysztof Wilczynski, and Steve Blaines. Each brings distinct approaches and specializations to the same fundamental problem, making Star Wars make sense in ways that official sources never bothered to achieve. These aren't hobbyists playing around in MS Paint. These are skilled professionals producing portfolio-quality work for a franchise that couldn't be bothered to match their output. And the community recognized this hierarchy of quality. When you wanted to understand how Imperial logistics actually worked, you didn't go to official canon sections. You went to Fractal Sponge. When you wanted to visualize fleet engagements, you pulled up renders from these fan artists because their work had the technical authenticity that official sources lacked. The fans had become the authorities. Lucasfilm just hadn't admitted it. The pipeline from fan work to official canon had been operating for nearly 2 decades by this point. Saxton's 1995 technical commentaries had pioneered the approach of cataloging and systematizing unofficial material. Hsiao's detailed 3D models built on that foundation. Other fan artists contributed their own designs, their own interpretations, their own solutions to problems that official sources had left unsolved. And then, Lucasfilm, recognizing that these fan resources had become authoritative, selectively adopted them into official canon, sometimes with proper acknowledgement, as in The Essential Guide to Warfare, sometimes through appropriation, as in the Imperial Handbook incident. The fan-to-canon pipeline was real, documented, ongoing. The only question was whether the fans would be credited for feeding it. Let me be concrete about what Hsiao's technical rigor actually looked like. Because this isn't abstract, it's granular, obsessive, beautiful work that exposed just how lazy official sources had been. Hull plating thickness. In official Star Wars lore, armor values are typically expressed in vague terms. Heavily armored. Reinforced hull plating. What does that actually mean? How thick is the plating? What material composition provides the stated protection? Lucasfilm never bothered to answer these questions. They assumed, probably correctly, that most viewers and readers wouldn't care. But Hsiao cared. And the fans who describe Imperial lore as their drug cared right alongside him. So he calculated hull thicknesses, worked out what level of protection would be consistent with observed combat performance in various Star Wars media, determined what structural requirements different areas of the ship would have. Hsiao's models included these variations. You could see the engineering logic embedded in every surface. Official Star Wars designs just had armor. Hsiao's designs had engineering. Point defense weapon replacement provides another illustration. When a Star Destroyer is attacked by enemy fighters, what weapons does it use to defend itself? The main turbo laser batteries are too large and slow tracking to engage starfighter-scale targets effectively. There must be smaller, faster weapons distributed across the hull for this purpose. But where? How many? What are their firing arcs? Lucasfilm's approach to this question was essentially, enough guns to look intimidating in wide shots, don't worry about the details. Hsiao's approach was to calculate defensive coverage zones, identify blind spots, position point defense batteries to provide overlapping fields of fire, map out the angles from which enemy fighters could approach, and ensure that every approach vector was covered by multiple weapon systems. A bomber making an attack run on the reactor dome needs to approach from a specific angle. What weapons can engage it during that approach? How long is it in the engagement envelope? How many point defense hits can it sustain before being disabled? These questions have answers in Hsiao's designs. They don't have answers in official sources because no one at Lucasfilm thought to ask them. The disparity extends to fleet doctrine itself. The Imperial Navy, as depicted in the films, is basically a collection of visually distinctive ships without clear roles or relationships. What's the difference between a Star Destroyer and a Victory-class Star Destroyer? When would you deploy one versus the other? How do different ship classes support each other in combat? These are the questions that military enthusiasts ask about real-world navies. The relationship between aircraft carriers and escort destroyers. The role of submarines in fleet operations. The logistics of keeping a battle group supplied during extended operations. They're the questions that Star Wars fans ask about the Imperial Navy. Official sources provided few coherent answers. Hsiao's designs came embedded in doctrine. The Procrusader operating ahead of the fleet as a scout and skirmisher, locating enemy formations and harassing their logistics while avoiding decisive engagement with superior forces. The Executor remaining in the fleet's core, launching fighter strikes while being protected by heavier combatants, providing the sustained starfighter operations that determine local space superiority. The Bellator serving as a fast response element, capable of redeploying rapidly to reinforce threatened sectors or pursue retreating enemies. The Assertor acting as a command dreadnought, coordinating operations at the highest levels of Imperial naval hierarchy. Each vessel had a role. Each role implied tactical contexts. The result was a military organization that behaved like a military organization, not a collection of props arranged for visual effect. Vindication, when the corporation won't give you credit, looks different than you might expect. It doesn't come with a check. It doesn't come with a credit on the title page. It comes from knowing. It comes from seeing official Star Wars media and recognizing design language that originated with fan artists. From reading a novel and spotting a ship class that existed as a fan creation years before it appeared in print. From having the receipts, the timestamps, the original posts, the documented evidence of who did what first, even when the corporation pretends otherwise. The community knows. Every time someone sees a Executor-class Star Destroyer in official Star Wars media, the community knows that Ansel Hsiao designed that ship. They know it started as a vague shape in a 1992 comic and became a fully realized warship because one fan put in the work that Lucasfilm wouldn't. Every time the Executor-class appears, that 15-kilometer dreadnought with the T-shaped bridge tower that Hsiao designed from scratch in 2011, the community knows. That's not Disney's creation. That's not Lucasfilm's creation. That's a fan creation that was good enough to become canon. The corporation can refuse to credit them, can fail to compensate them, can pretend that the world building happened in some official design studio. But the community knows the truth. And increasingly, so does everyone else. Consider what this says about the nature of creative ownership in franchise properties. Lucasfilm owns Star Wars legally. That's not in dispute. They own the trademarks, the copyrights, the licensing rights. When Disney acquired Lucasfilm, they acquired a portfolio of intellectual property that generates billions in revenue every year. But legal ownership isn't the same as creative ownership. Creative ownership, the deep understanding of what makes a fictional universe work, the commitment to internal consistency, the labor of filling gaps and resolving contradictions, that belongs to the community. The people who care enough to calculate reactor outputs. The people who spend 80-hour weeks modeling warships because they want to see them done right. Lucasfilm owns Star Wars, the brand. The fans own Star Wars, the universe. And the corporation has been quietly extracting value from that community-built universe for decades, taking the designs, adopting the interpretations, absorbing the world building that the fans produced for free, and then selling it back to them. The 2014 Imperial Handbook incident was just the most blatant example. The extraction was constant. The receipts exist. The Executor-class, anonymous background ship in Dark Empire 2, February 1992. Full engineering and naming by Ansel Hsiao, early 2000s. Official canon adoption in The Essential Guide to Warfare, 2012. Canon appearance in Tarkin, 2014. The Executor-class, pure fan creation by Ansel Hsiao in 3ds Max, 2011. 15-kilometer star dreadnought that didn't exist in any Star Wars media. Now referenced in fan discussions as if it were always official. The Procursator, the Bellator, the Vigil. All products of fan engineering that gave the Imperial Navy the doctrinal coherence it had always lacked. The Imperial Handbook incident. Documented appropriation of Hsiao's Lambda, Star Destroyer, and Executor renders in 2014. Blog post evidence. Community witnesses. Contractor theft enabled by corporate indifference. This isn't speculation, it's history. And the history says something uncomfortable about how franchise properties really work. The corporation doesn't own the creative heart of Star Wars. It just owns the legal wrapper. The actual world building, the stuff that makes this universe feel real and coherent and worth caring about, that belongs to the community. The fans who do the work. The artists who engineer the ships. The obsessives who catalog every contradiction and develop solutions to explain them. Disney can buy the brand. They can't buy that love. And they can't replicate the work that love produces. So they take it instead. Ansel Hsiao is still out there, still designing ships, still producing work that exceeds what the official franchise typically manages. You can find his portfolio at fractalsponge.net, where years of meticulous engineering are available for anyone who wants to see what passionate craftsmanship looks like. He didn't get paid for most of what became canon. He didn't get credited for everything he contributed. But he built something that the corporation couldn't. And every time someone looks at his work, official or unofficial, credited or not, they're seeing what happens when love for a universe exceeds the resources that supposedly control it. Those of you who care about logistics, who crave that mechanical realism, who describe Imperial lore as my drug, you're getting your fix from the fan community. From the people who spent decades filling the gaps that Lucasfilm left empty. From artists like Ansel Hsiao, who charged $80 an hour professionally and should have charged Lucasfilm every cent. You already knew this, probably. You already suspected that the best Star Wars world building came from outside official sources. That the corporation was taking more than it gave. That the community had become the true custodian of this universe, regardless of who held the trademarks. Now you have receipts. The fans were right. The fans were better. The fans did the work. Subscribe for more stories like this.